views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hi guys, I'm Em, also known as the Hungry Dominican, and I'm your host for Foodie Down Bronx. This is the show where we catch up with artists, entrepreneurs, chefs, and foodies who make a part of the incredible and ever-growing Bronx food scene. So if you like to eat, get your appetites ready and stay tuned. From BronxNet to the world, this is Foodie Down Bronx. Welcome to Foodie Down Bronx. Stay connected to us on Instagram at BronxNetTV, at Foodie Down Bronx, and follow me at The Hungry Dominican. Street food in New York City, we all love it, but recently the arrest of churro ladies has been stirring up the web. We'll sit with Matthew Shapiro of Street Vendors Project to discuss street vendor rights and more. But before we sit with our guests, let's get into this week's Chew News. Anthony Kalin, a sommelier well known in the world of wine, has resigned from his position as beverage director at The Usual, a restaurant located in the Nolita section of Manhattan. The 29-year-old left his position after the New York Times reported earlier this month that 4 women have come forward and accused him of sexual harassment. According to the report, Kalin invited his guests over to his apartment for wine, sometimes drugs, and got sexually aggressive with them. New York Times food reporter Julia Moskin also reported seeing an email exchange where Kalin was told to stay away from wine retailer Domaine LA, following reports from female employees stating that he made them feel uncomfortable. 2 of the women who came forward with the accusation stated that they did so now because of Anthony Kalin's appearance on Wine and Spirits magazine, where he was included on its Best New Psalms list, which he has now been removed from. Anthony Kalin is brother to chef Alvin Kalin and has denied any wrongdoing. A Minnesota school district is apologizing after a video went viral showing its lunch workers throwing away the hot lunches of students who had an outstanding lunch debt of more than $15 and replacing it with a cold lunch. Richfield High School, located 7 miles away from Minneapolis, was thrown into the national spotlight just several months after Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar introduced a bill back in June called the No Shame at School Act that aimed at ending lunch debt shaming at schools. She goes on to say, no child should incur a debt because of their financial constraints beyond their control. Along with that bill, Congresswoman Omar also introduced a bill last month alongside Bernie Sanders called the Universal School Meals Program Act, which would provide a free breakfast, lunch, and dinner to every student in America without demanding that they prove they are poor enough to receive the meals. The Congresswoman also states that 1 in 10 households in Minnesota suffer from food insecurity, which is true in other places like right here in the Bronx. What do you think? Should school lunch be universally free for all kids? Weigh in our Instagram at Foodie Down Bronx and at mine at The Hungry Dominican. In other news, Dean Foods, the largest dairy producer in the country, has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Dean Foods distributes many brands, including Land O'Lakes, Mayfield Dairy, and produces the Friendly's brand of ice cream. Profits for the company fell 14% during the first half of the year, and the company has also lost 80% of their stock, according to CNN. The dairy industry has been struggling as of late due to competition from milk alternatives being prolific and consumers changing dietary restrictions. Moving along, Whole Foods is recalling over 70 products from its stores over listeria concerns. Those products include items from their hot bar, salad bar, and frozen packaged meals. The bacteria that is more likely to affect pregnant women, the elderly, and people with weakened immune systems. The recalled items were shipped between October 10th and November 4th. And while there have been no confirmed illnesses linked to the products as of yet, it is advised that you either throw away your products or head to your nearest Whole Foods to receive a full refund with proof of purchase. All right, guys, that is this week's Chew News, giving you a little food for thought. Foodie Down Bronx, we'll be right back.
think what makes Havana Cafe special or different is just our overall environment. It's not just a restaurant.
80% of our guests are return customers, which is wonderful for us. Become a neighborhood gem. This is a restaurant that serves predominantly Cuban dishes.
We have a really well-rounded menu. We have vegetarian, we have vegan options. We also have great sandwiches. Regardless of what you're looking for, we have traditional Latin food, we have traditional Cuban food, but we also have lighter fare. We have a very well-rounded menu, and there's something for everybody.
So we have mojitos. Our bartenders are first class.
Our mojitos are hand muddled, every single one. What people should expect when they come here is that they encounter a family-friendly environment.
I think most of all, what I want people to experience and walk away with is a feeling that they walked in somewhere where they were made to feel like they were at home.
The overall ambiance, the overall feel of family and community and comfort and friendliness that they encounter when they come here, it's genuine. And I think people, they sense that.
To me, Latin cuisine is really an emotion. It has a lot to do, obviously, with good ingredients, but it's about the passion that you put into the food that you do. And that's what we want people to feel when they come here.
Welcome back to Foodie Down Bronx. I'm your host, M, the Hungry Dominican. There are as many as 20,000 street vendors in New York City, from tacos, hot dogs, and shish kebabs to t-shirts and flowers. You name it, and street vendors have it, and they make a part of the incredible New York City culture hub. But in the midst of International Street Vendor Day, celebrated on November 14th, a video has recently surfaced online showing the arrest of two well-known churro ladies in the city. But what exactly happened, and what are street vendors' rights? The Street Vendor Project is part of the Urban Justice Center, a nonprofit organization that provides legal representation and advocacy to various marginalized groups of New Yorkers. Joining us now to provide more information is Matthew Shapiro, Legal Director of the Street Vendor Project. Matthew, thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So we have a lot of important topics to cover, but before the show started taping, you told me that your parents are from the Bronx. So you've actually spent a lot of time in the Bronx growing up. Which part of the Bronx are your parents from?
So my parents were both born and raised in Pelham Parkway on either side of it. So I have a lot of memories. They moved to Miami in the late 70s, but growing up in Miami, we'd always come visit New York 3 or 4 times a year, and mostly we would be staying in the Bronx because that's where my grandparents lived, both sets of grandparents and also great aunts and uncles. So yeah, my childhood is full of trips to the Bronx to visit my extended family. And so the Bronx has a special place in my heart.
It's very, very cool. Before we move on, are there any parts of the Bronx that you just have, besides Pelham, of course, that you have a really close, wonderful memory of?
So my cousin still has actually an outerwear store on Southern Boulevard in South Bronx.
Very cool.
So while my parents, grew up further north and we would spend time in Pelham Parkway, we'd always go visit the store down in the South Bronx. So that has another soft spot.
Awesome. So I had stated in the opening remarks that there are 20,000 vendors in New York City. And of course, it's an array of the type of vendors. They sell different products.
Right.
Can you explain to me a little bit about what the Street Vendor Project is about and how they represent those 20,000 vendors?
Right. So the Street Vendor Project functions sort of like a union for all of the vendors that you see working outside. We do a lot of organizing to build a strong community of vendors so they'll have a better say in the laws and policies that affect them. And we also provide legal and small business services to help make sure they know their rights and also help their businesses stay viable.
So is it sort of like a grassroots type of thing where you go to them and you advise them of their rights?
Very much so. We have, organizers who are on the streets, walking around various parts of the city, talking to vendors, making sure they know about the organization, trying to get them to become members so they'll participate in our actions and events, but also letting them know of the services that we provide. So
you asked them to become members of the Street Vendor Project, and through that they have accessibility to workshops, to meetings, and like you said, it works like a union.
Right.
So they're informed often enough about what sort of opposition they might be facing when they're in the streets.
That's right. We have membership meetings every month at our office, and vendors from all over the city come. We talk about our current campaign work, what's happening out there on the streets. They have access to free legal counsel if they need it. Vendors, there's lots of enforcement issues about, against vendors in the city, so they'll come in with various legal issues that they need help with. We also have walk-in hours at our office during the day, so vendors can come in at any time and bring their issues.
And I'm assuming that some time is spent at 149th Street, right here in the Bronx. There's so many vendors in that location. So that's how it works. You guys go from borough to borough, and you speak to these vendors, and you inform them of what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it can be somewhat random depending on what's happening at the time. We could say, oh, well, we know there's a bunch of vendors at the hub, for example, so we'll go up there and spend an afternoon walking around and talking to every single vendor that we see, making sure that they know about the organization, trying to get contact info, inviting them to our office. Or if there's something happening in a particular neighborhood, we might go out to that neighborhood to respond and talk to the vendors there to see what's going on.
Wonderful. So let's get into the arrest of the two churro vendors, both in Brooklyn. Right. These women were, their arrests were caught on tape. Their situations were all over social media. Right. And that sort of started this conversation now that we're having that you had mentioned. Usually when a vendor gets arrested, it's either no news coverage or very little, and we sort of just move on from the conversation. Right. And it's not the case with these two arrests, and also extending to the gentleman that was arrested in the Harlem station. And you had said that because this directly connects to the over-policing of the subway systems, the conversation seems to be more on the forefront. Governor Cuomo said that there was a lot of quality of life issues in the subway systems, and a lot of finger pointing and blame is put upon all of these politicians or people who are in charge of certain departments. At the end of the day, what do you think is the major problem that's happening in the subway systems when it comes to these vendors?
Right, well, I think that's exactly right. Vendors are far too often seen as a problem or something that we need to deal with. They're not very often seen as what they are, small businesses. So whenever there's an issue with vendors, the police are always the ones that are there to respond. And I always thought that was, I'm used to it now. I understand that's what happens. I'm always wondering, why that is. For example, if there was an issue with a restaurant that they didn't have proper signage or something, could you imagine the police going into a restaurant and it becoming a criminal justice issue? That would never happen. But because they're street vendors and because vendors have always been immigrants and always been sort of more marginalized compared to other populations in New York, the police are the first ones to respond, and then we end up with incidents like we saw last week with the churro vendors.
So do you feel this is more of a targeted type of situation where the sort of like the strong arm of the law is sort of emphasized more on these immigrants who are vendors?
It's funny. I don't think that there is I think that vendors have always dealt with enforcement. It just so happens that this was caught on tape. But vendors deal with similar issues all around the city, whether they're getting tickets or kicked out of their spots or, unfortunately arrested sometimes. That's been happening for years and years. So I think the fact that it was caught on tape and the fact that now we're talking about all these issues in our transit system and the addition of 500 new cops in the subways, all these different issues have combined to make sort of a perfect storm, which has rightfully fueled outrage over what's been happening.
Right. So a lot of the official reasoning for the extra 500 cops was that the MTA was losing a lot of money because people were beating the tolls and they weren't paying for their fare. But then we see what we see on these tapes where everything's been directed to seemingly all these vendors, and yet fare evasion doesn't seem to be ever going away. It's a problem that's going to be consistent with the MTA. So do you feel that adding an extra 500 cops was even worth it, considering that, again, people will evade the fare, and now it seems like they're just targeting something else to sort of justify their existence in the subway system?
Yeah, it seems like a misdirection of resources, considering we're at a time now where the transit system needs such additional help in terms of maintaining, its schedules and make sure the trains are running on time. I feel like that should be the focus of any other resources that are put into the system, not hiring additional police officers to chase away churro vendors or stop people from jumping the turnstiles.
Right.
I think there are other better proposals. We have the Fair Fares initiative, which I think once it's rolled out, to more people, will allow people who can't afford the $2.75 to buy discounted fare. But I think there'll always be some portion of people that can't afford to ride the subways.
Right.
But I think that if we can focus more on maintaining the trains and making sure they run on time, that would be,
I agree with you on that one.
that'd be a better use of resources than
Absolutely.
Bothering folks that are selling candy or churros.
Yeah, absolutely. So a spokesperson for Mayor de Blasio had sent out a tweet during the time of these incidents with the churro ladies, saying that the MTA should be policing the situation. The quote is, "We're calling on the MTA to designate zones where food vendors can sell their goods, freeing up our officers to focus on keeping New Yorkers safe." Then another tweet sent out by the MTA's chief communications officer fired back saying, "That's not what the MTA does. We are responsible for running a safe and secure transit system. The recent incidents with vendors involved unlicensed vendors. The city has not raised the cap since the 80s. I want to get into that. So there are actually caps put in place allowing a designated amount of permits given off to vendors. So meaning that if you want to be a vendor in New York City, it's sometimes a crapshoot to even get a permit to legally vend. When were those caps put into place? Because I have found different references going from either 79, 83, so it was around that time period, but when exactly were they implemented?
Right. Well, you're right on both counts. Depending on what type of vendors we're talking about, the caps were put in place at different times. So we can break street vendors into two generally distinct groups. We have food vendors, and then we have general vendors, which sell non-food items, merchandise, things like that. And there's a limit on both the number of licenses for general vendors and also the number of permits for food vendors. So those are the two items that you need in order to be a general vendor or a food vendor, and they're both limited, they're both capped. So in 1979, a cap was placed on the number of general merchandise licenses at 853. There's a special exception for veterans, but if you're not a veteran, the cap is 853 for general vendors. And then for food vendors, a cap on the number of permits was put in place in 1983. And depending on what type of permit you're talking about, there are anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 permits for food vending in the city.
So let's get into some of the permits that I found some information on. So it says that there are 2,800 full-term citywide permits valid for a 2-year period.
Right.
Then you have your 100 full-time citywide permits exclusively for disabled veterans.
Right.
Then you have your 200 full-term borough-specific permits. 50 permits available for each borough, other than Manhattan, valid also for 2 years.
Right.
Then you have your seasonal permits.
Right.
How much do those permits cost? Do they vary in prices depending on which ones you get? Your full-term, your seasonal, your veterans? How much is the price point?
So if you're a permit holder, if you actually hold one of these permits, you get it you've gotten it from the city many years ago, and you renew it every 2 years at a cost of around $200. So you pay $200 to the city, you get the permit for 2 years. Now, all of these permit holders, maybe they used to be vendors many years ago, but now they're by and large not vending anymore. Maybe they have another job, maybe they're retired. So what they do is they rent out these permits on an underground market. So the vast majority of all the vendors you see working out on the street, if they're working on a cart or a truck that has a permit, that permit is not in their name. They're leasing it from somebody that has that permit at a price between sometimes $20,000 or $25,000. Wow. So a huge markup from the city price. So that's because the demand for these permits are really high and the supply has been kept low since 1983. So that's why we have this underground market.
So how is that still a thing, right? I mean, we know they exist, right? I mean, you're here talking about them, so it's not like it's a secret. It's sort of known that there's a black market for these permits. Why is there no crackdown on that?
At various times throughout the years, there have been attempts by the city to infiltrate and stop this underground market. The Department of Investigation did a whole operation a number of years ago, but they were unable to do anything about it. And I'm not sure of the exact reason, but they said they couldn't find a strong enough connection between the permit owners and the permit renters. There was not enough proof to actually show they were renting out the permit, because you could think about it, right? If you have a business, you could have different partners in the business, and each partner could bring something of their own to the business. So you could have one partner that has the permit, one partner that has the cart or the truck, another partner that's managing the operation. So it's very hard to prove that they're physically giving over the permit, to someone. That's difficult because of the whole sort of gray area and the way the businesses can operate.
Sure.
So I think maybe that's why the city hasn't been able to do anything about it. A far more easier approach would be to just increase the number of permits available to make the underground market go away. So that's what the street vendors would like.
One of the I suppose the loudest critics for allowing to give away these, or not give away, but permit more permits is the mayor. He's saying that if we did that, then that would just create this, this idea that anyone can get this permit without having maybe proper evaluation, or just allowing more vendors to come in. And I guess it's like another quality of life issue. What do you feel about that? Do you feel like that would actually create that situation where just now, you have, let's say, extra slots to allow these vendors to get permits? Will the quality go down? Or just open up the entire market?
It really depends on your perception. And I think going back to what we were talking about before, vendors have sometimes been seen by certain groups of people in the city and by certain governments at various times as a problem or a nuisance or something to deal with. But I think the vast majority of New Yorkers, everyday New Yorkers, would see vendors as an amenity and as enhancing their quality of life, not as a quality of life problem to be dealt with. So I think the fact that anyone could become a vendor is actually a good thing, because vendors have always been mostly new immigrants coming to this country, and they should be given the opportunities to sort of get a foothold in the economic industry in New York City. It's difficult coming here for the first time to have $1 million to open a restaurant, or $500,000, whatever it costs. But if you can get a permit from the city at a reasonable cost and have a 10 by 5 foot push cart on the street and start a business that way, that's economic development. That's entrepreneurship. The city should be encouraging that. We've had, numerous examples of popular businesses that have started off as street vendors.
Right, correct.
It's funny, the Wegmans just opened up in Brooklyn, right? That was started from a produce cart. So all of these good examples and things that we want to encourage, but because of this limit, because of the barriers to entry, it makes it so difficult for vendors to even get a start. So that's why we think lifting the caps would be a good idea.
One of the biggest forms of opposition that vendors get are from these brick and mortar stores, these restaurants, that believe that if there's a vendor that's parked in front of their shop, that they're basically undercutting their own business. Is that something that, are there actual numbers for that? Can we lean on that to be the truth, or is that a situation in which, because brick and mortar stores, have a physical space and they're paying their rent and they're paying their taxes and they're paying whatever they're paying, the city can sort of be a little bit more lenient on them and hear them out more, and sort of give them an unfair advantage to get their voice heard versus the vendors?
Well, I agree with you that there's a narrative out there that says that restaurants and brick and mortar stores are against vendors. But the research that we've done and all of the history and the time that we've spent talking to both brick and mortar stores and vendors, show that clearly isn't true. In fact, we believe, and we've found out, that most of the vendors and brick and mortar stores have a complementary relationship, right? When you have a street that's full of vendors versus an empty street, you're more likely to walk down the street with vendors because it's more interesting, it's eye-catching, and that will bring more foot traffic to that block, which results in more business for everyone, the vendors and the brick and mortars.
Right.
Back in the late 1800s and 1900s on the Lower East Side, there were tons of pushcart markets. There were peddlers, mostly Jewish and Italian back then, selling all sorts of goods, and whole streets were full of vendors. And there was an effort back then also to clean up the streets and to move all these vendors inside into enclosed markets. And when that happened, the documents show that the brick and mortar stores and the shops actually complained that they saw less foot traffic because people weren't coming down to those streets anymore to go shopping because the vendors were gone. So there's a real synergy there between vendors on the street and brick and mortar businesses. And I think that, you know, there's this sort of false narrative out there that there's unfair competition. It's not unfair competition, right? This is New York City. Yep. There's customers for everyone. It's true, restaurants and brick and mortar stores pay a lot in rent. They have a lot of expenses, but they also get a lot more. They get large, relatively large spaces. They get heating and cooling. They get tables and chairs for their customers. What do vendors get? They pay a lot less, but they also get maybe 10 feet of space outside, no heating, no cooling, no tables and chairs for their customers. So they're getting a whole lot less too. So it doesn't seem unfair to me. It just seems like a different market. You might have someone just needs to get a quick bite to eat or can't afford to go into a restaurant, so they're able to get, you know, a $5 plate of chicken and rice from the vendor. I never saw the situation where someone is like, oh, let's go to this restaurant and have lunch or dinner, and then they're walking and they see like a food cart and say, oh no, let's just grab something quick. You know, if you want to go to the restaurant, you go to the restaurant. If you want to get something quick from the food vendor, you go to the food vendor. So this is New York City. There have always been food vendors. There will always be food vendors. There have been restaurants and stores. There will always be restaurants and stores. So there's enough to go around.
But I'm assuming you still probably do talk to some folks here and there that could say, I do have a problem with this vendor being in front of my store or in the same block.
Yeah.
I mean, it's might be a false narrative, but you know, I've talked to some business owners who've had problems with certain vendors. But I would look out the window and I would be like, but he's selling bananas and you have full cuisines here. You know, so I don't really know. And again, it's always two sides to each story, of course. But I just wonder if it's a situation where, because it's a brick and mortar, they might have, you know, more of their voice might be heard more than a vendor.
Exactly, right. So it all depends on sort of how the balance of power exists in New York City. The restaurant industry has a strong lobbying group. Brick and mortars tend to be more organized and more informed and have more connections to politicians in New York City than street vendors who tend to be from more marginalized and vulnerable populations. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. And yeah, there are times that we hear from brick and mortar stores that have concerns about vendors. It's extremely rare that we'll have a vendor that's selling the exact same thing that the brick and mortar store. Vendors by nature are selling more limited items versus brick and mortar and restaurants that tend to have more expansive menus. So it's very, very rare that you have a vendor selling the exact same thing that a brick and mortar store is, where they're only selling that item. So yeah, and it just doesn't really happen. But yeah, we do hear concerns from brick and mortar stores, and in individual cases we hope to work out and actually just bring both sides together so they can hear from each other. Right? That's what you said, there's two sides. So we need each side to hear each other out and then hopefully to come to some agreement.
Right. Before we go to break, I wanted to ask you, we're in New York, 5 boroughs, of course. Which of the boroughs has the most street vendors?
Good question.
Well, I would say, I'm sorry, I would even say that let's focus on 4 boroughs, because I don't really know, you know.
There are some in Staten Island. It's definitely not the most populous in terms of vendors.
Yeah.
You know, we don't have data. People ask all the time, how many exactly how many vendors are there? And we don't have data because of these limits on the number of licenses and permits. There are lots of people that are taking a risk and doing it without a license or without a permit. So we don't know the exact number of vendors. We have that estimate between 10 and 20,000. But I don't know. So because of that, I don't know exactly which borough has the most number. But if I had to guess, I would say Queens. There seems to be a lot of areas in Queens that have high density of vendors. So I would guess that Queens might have the most number, but I can't tell you for sure.
It seems like it. When I walk through the borough, I'm like, there's a lot of vendors here. All right, excellent. Guys, grab yourselves a snack. Foodie Down Bronx. We'll be right back.
Social Club has been here for about 9 months now. We do wood-fired pizza in our oven there. Everything we do here is homemade, from the dough to basically every ingredient we use is fresh. Our chef, Tom, is trained in Italy. He's owned a couple other restaurants before, and this is kind of his specialty. We love this neighborhood. I've lived in this neighborhood for 7 years. And the neighborhood is still growing. You know, the residents really want more diversity in the restaurant, so we thought it'd be something that the neighborhood would really like to have. So far the response is great. I mean, everybody loves the food. I think people are really happy to have something different than the other places that have been around here for a while. The focus is the stuff that comes out of the oven behind me. The pizza is the main thing that we do here, and then beyond that, homemade meatballs and spaghetti. It's just kind of comfort food, especially for this time of year. We have pub buffalo wings. They're made with cherry peppers and a vinegar brine. They're really tasty. The oven we got, it's called a Pavesi spinner. It's made in Italy, and one of the cool features of it is that the deck spins so that it helps cook the pizza evenly, so we always get the consistent pizza we like. So we had locally well-known graffiti artist who goes by Tracy168, so we brought him in to kind of keep the local vibe. And we're here 7 days a week, open for lunch and dinner, and I hope everybody in Kingsbridge, Riverdale area and beyond, throughout the Bronx, you know, come check it out.
Welcome back to Foodie Down Bronx. I'm your host, M, the Hungry Dominican. I'm joined on set by Matthew Shapiro of the Street Vendor Project. We're continuing our discussion on street vendors. Matt, I wanted to talk about a bill that is being promoted to lift the cap on the permits. State Senator Jessica Ramos is the one promoting it. Can you give me some more details on that?
Yeah, so we were really inspired by what happened in California and Los Angeles, where for many, many years sidewalk vending was completely illegal. There were thousands of vendors that did it because, just like here, people need to make a living. So last year they had a big victory where the governor of California actually signed a law that lifted the cap on, or made street vending completely legal, and said they couldn't put a limit on the number of permits or licenses that they would issue. So we were very inspired by that, and Senator Ramos is from Queens and has a long history of knowing the street food and street vending scene in her district. So she's also a big supporter of vendors. And she has introduced a bill to do a similar thing here statewide in New York, to say that you can't limit the number of vendors that can operate. You can have regulations, reasonable restrictions, but in terms of the actual number, you can't limit that. And that would be a huge victory for vendors if that went through.
Now, we're talking about 40 years of the caps being in place. Do you see this actually getting any traction? Do you think this will actually be something that's feasible, that's done?
We're hopeful. We know that street vending is a contentious issue here in New York City, because there have been, for years, there have been powerful, small groups of powerful interests that have opposed street vending, real estate industry, business improvement districts, what have you. So those folks have been always opposed to any expansion of the number of street vendors. But because now we've seen the state bill, and there's actually another bill in the city that's been there for a few years trying to increase the number of permits. So we feel like there's momentum behind it, and we hope that something will happen.
So we started off the first half of the conversation with the Truro ladies being arrested in Brooklyn. And on the Street Vendor Project website, streetvendor.org, there is an article that's written there about female vendors. Can you give me specifics about what it is that that article mentions?
Right. So the background on that is that, when we think of vendors, especially in Manhattan, for example, Midtown and downtown, what do we see? Well, they're mostly male. And there have always been a lot of male street vendors. But we realize that, especially more in the outer boroughs, most of the vendors are female. And we started having a lot more female vendors come into the office over the years, and we realized that hey, there are a lot more women vending. So we decided to form a women's committee and do a survey and ultimately issue a report on the specific challenges faced by women vendors when they're working out there in the street, because given the gender dynamics and the fact that a lot of vendors are male, women vendors are facing specific issues. We found that a lot of women vendors tend to be single mothers, tend to have multiple children that they need to take care of, so they often turn to vending as a way to earn some income to pay their rent, to support their kids, because it affords them a little bit of flexibility, right? They can drop the kids off at school, run out and sell for a few hours, pick the kids up, or sometimes bring the kids with them to their vending spot. And so these vendors are facing unique challenges. And the city really should support this population of vendors because they're probably the most vulnerable and marginalized. And they're also the most in need of permits. The vast majority of these vendors that we survey tend to be vending without permits. So actually lifting the cap on permits, we think disproportionately help women vendors, which would be a great thing.
What are the fines if you're not if you're operating without a permit?
So if you're selling without a permit, the fines are $1,000.
$1,000.
Yeah, and the city can take your cart or your vending property. They can seize that. There's also sometimes you can be arrested, as we unfortunately saw last week. So yeah, really, really high enforcement consequences.
So how is one able to get a cart, for example? You have a vending cart, you don't have a permit. How are you able to get that cart? Is there a system in play that you have to show proof of you having a permit, or I guess not?
So depending on what you're selling, I mean, vendors are really creative, right? So we have the vendors in the subway that have sold churros, right? They're selling from basically modified laundry carts. And you might see vendors on the sidewalk that are selling from shopping carts or tables sometimes selling fruits and vegetables. Because they can't get permits, they don't want to invest in, so-called proper equipment, right? Like officially sanctioned metal carts that you might see on the sidewalks that actually have permits. They're realizing the risk and the fact that their carts and property can be taken at any moment, so they're mostly selling from more humble stands or carts, which don't require the same investment that an official permitted cart would.
Right. So they're essentially putting themselves at risk to either be fined or in these cases arrested, and that's interesting because I always wondered how are these people here, because it just like you're saying, they're doing modified shopping carts. So how is it possible that they're doing this? I also wanted to mention there's been a lot of protests that street vendors are partaking in because of what's going on, and I would assume that you've been there yourself. You've seen what's going on. You've understood their plight and what they're going through. Is there a future where they're going to get what they want? I mean, again, we have the bill promoting the cap or lifting the cap on permits, but it just seems like because it's been going on perpetually for so long, I want to be positive about it, but I just don't know if this is ever going to change. Do you really see this coming to an end?
I think that we do. At what point and how many more permits will be released is something that I think that's the variable. Senator Ramos's bill is great. I hope that there would be a lifting of the caps. I mean, before 1983, there were no caps. It would be great if we went back to that situation. It'd be great if there were unlimited opportunities. I just wanted to be clear, just because we say lifting of the caps doesn't mean that the streets that would be, wall-to-wall vendors. There are numerous regulations and restrictions in place governing where vendors with permits can and cannot go, making sure the sidewalk is wide enough for pedestrians to pass and so forth. So the so-called statement of chaos on the streets simply isn't true.
Right.
So I think that, yes, we'll get to a point where there's more opportunities for vendors. I hope it's sooner rather than later. And we hope that there will be a lifting of the caps as proposed by the state bill. So I think recently we're helped by the momentum that's been there. A lot of politicians have been coming out in support of vendors in light of what's happened to the vendors who were arrested. So I hope that momentum continues and the politicians' actions follow their words.
Right. I want to zero in on the incident in the Harlem subway station. I also have a question for you.
Okay.
Does someone like a churro lady who sells from a modified shopping cart, does someone who's selling candy in a subway car, do they somehow have the same rights as a vendor, or are we like talking about murky waters here? Like, how does that work?
Right. So you mentioned before the interplay between the mayor and the city and the MTA, and that's exactly the issue here. So vendors that are selling within the subway system or on MTA property have another layer of issues and another layer of risk, because not only do you need a license and permit from the city to be a vendor, if you want to sell on MTA property, you also need special permission from the MTA, which they don't give to street vendors. There's no system for vending in the subways in place. There never has been. So it's always been sort of this underground, no pun intended, system where vendors have been taking an additional risk, because not only can they be fined for vending without a license and permit, they can be subject to all the MTA's regulations and enforcement, which is what we saw last week with the churro vendors. So it's another layer of risk. But people have been doing it for years. You know, where there's opportunity, there will be business, and the city should encourage that or come up with a system and allow them to sell. You know, ensure that there's safe passage for people getting on and off the trains, but allow them to sell. I mean, the city allows artists to perform on the platforms and musicians, and they have kiosks and newsstands in various subways, although those seem to be declining. Some subway stations even have fancy food halls, I've seen in Manhattan. Right. So there's all these opportunities there, but we should, you know, provide opportunities to those who need it most, vendors.
Right. And you had mentioned this before, that a lot of vendors are immigrants. They're coming to this country, they're trying their best to live the American dream, and they're getting so much pushback. And you also mentioned that a lot of these permits are being rented by other vendors, and the ones who are the original holders are people who moved on from their vending. How many vendors do you see sort of just give up the entire dream of doing this because there's been so much opposition, so much pushback? Or do you see them doing what you mentioned, which is renting out these permits?
Yeah, I think it depends on the situation. I mean, if you have a good spot, let's say you're selling on the sidewalk and you're at a busy, you know, on a busy street, and you have a loyal customer base for many years, even if you're renting a permit, some people are able to make a business. Now, they're not getting rich. It's not like winning the lottery, right? They're able to make a decent living and maybe support their family. For those that are doing it without a permit, some people do it part of the year. Some people will do it few years and then give it up and do some other job. People want security. So the fact that if they were able to get their own permit in their own name, they'd be able to do better because they wouldn't have to pay that $20,000 or $25,000, or they just have the security that they would be able to do it, you know, free of enforcement. So I think that's really what vendors want. It's just a fair shake.
A fair shake, which, you know, it's difficult for them to get it in the city. I've had some family members who were food vendors a while ago, and they couldn't do it. They just gave up on it, and I didn't really understand the importance of what it was to them. I didn't realize all the hardships they had to go through. Yeah. And I would assume that through the Street Vendor Project, you do have these stories where people will just sort of spill out everything they've been through. Is it a safe space in that sense where they can go, you know, and have these meetings with you guys and talk about their troubles, their feelings? I mean, it's an emotional situation to be in when you're spending so much money. And some of these people have shifts for 12 hours. Some of them are you know, they're there all day. What is the emotional effect that you've seen with these vendors that you deal with?
Yeah, I think that there is severe hardship that a lot of vendors go through. I mean, I'm thinking about the vendors that are out there every morning selling coffee. I mean, they're waking up at 2 in the morning or 2:30 in the morning to go to the commissary where their carts are stored and prepare the coffee and get everything ready, to then be at the spots by 4 o'clock where the first customers are coming to buy coffee. So, I mean, I couldn't even imagine that, waking up at 2 in the morning for years and years and years, just to be out there to sell coffee every morning. Because as New Yorkers, right, we expect that. Yeah. We expect that there'll be coffee on every corner in the morning. But we don't think about all the work that goes into it, right? Who is that person behind the cart? You know, what are they going through? Just like the churro vendors, right? We sort of expected to see maybe mangoes in the summer or churros in the winter on certain subway platforms. But we don't really think about, well, what is that? Who is that person, and what are the risks? What are the risks that they may be taking, and what is their life like? So yeah, I mean, we hear all these types of stories at the Street Vendor Project because there's really no other place for vendors to go to. The city doesn't have an office of street vending. There's no street vending ombudsman, which maybe there should be. So we have this organization, or a place that vendors can go and organize and talk about their issues, and more importantly, come up with ways to solve them.
Right. Let's talk about a little bit of the subject of safety. We mentioned female vendors and how they have their own situations and problems to deal with. When it comes to the subject of safety, what's the one reoccurring thing that you keep hearing about when it comes to street vendors?
It's mostly their interactions with the police and other authorities. I mean, there are issues with vendors on the street, issues of crime and other things like that, and women vendors feel that disproportionately. But by and large, the biggest issue, people don't feel safe when they see the police coming, which is sort of the opposite of what we think should happen, right? The police, some people think the police should be there to help us feel safe, and yeah, that's a strong point. But by and large, when the vendors see the police, their first instance, especially if they're vending without a permit or license, is to run, because they're worried about getting fines, they're worried about getting their stuff taken, they're worried potentially about getting arrested. So that's been the number one point when we talk about safety and street vending.
So my mind went to getting robbed, any number of things, but you're saying that the police are the ones that really cause them the most agita.
The police or other enforcement agencies, right? The health department's out there also writing fines and doing enforcement. Sometimes there are these joint task force inspections with different city agencies. They'll come and do sweeps of various neighborhoods. So I think, yeah, I mean, robberies and issues like that, those do happen, but it's far, far less than just the constant fear when you're out there, especially if you're vending without a license or permit, the fear you have of the potential risk of enforcement from city agencies.
One of the churro ladies who was taken in by the police, they had said that she had 2 open warrants. And they had mentioned that she had been in the same predicament before. Financially, that must take a toll on them as well, right? Of course, we mentioned that they have fines to deal with. And I guess I'm trying to figure out, what is the mentality of, you have these open warrants, you have all these fines, but you're still out there all the time. And of course, sometimes it's inevitable, meaning that you have to work, you have to make the money you can. Right. But I feel like there's so much bravery on their part, because they know that any day, any of this can go away, because of the fact that maybe they do have warrants, maybe they do have fines, maybe they're going to get fined. Will there ever be any laws, do you think, that can sort of protect them more? I mean, the idea of what you guys do is amazing, but to actually facilitate that and make that into law, do you think any of the ideas that you guys have would ever become official?
Yeah, and I think we talked about the state bill there. There's language in the state bill which would hopefully decriminalize vending, which means that vendors would not or should not be subject to arrest or any type of criminal justice consequence, right? So if you're a vendor and let's say that you do happen to be breaking one of the rules or regulations that apply to vendors, there shouldn't be an arrest there, right? The maximum that should happen should be a civil fine or a civil penalty at some reasonable amount. But we don't think that vendors should be subject to the criminal justice system, because vendors are not a criminal justice issue, right? It's a small business issue. So I don't know why the police are the ones that are immediately involved, right? There should be a special agency created to both help vendors and also deal with regulation. And they definitely should not be, arrested or subject to criminal court or any of that, because they're just trying to make a living and they're not doing anything inherently wrong or illegal.
Right. So we saw the arrest of the churro lady. It was all over social media. Have you seen the effect on social media when it comes to situations like this, right? You have these situations that before, like you had mentioned, maybe got coverage for one day, one story on the evening news, that's really it. Now we're seeing it perpetually happen. Plus or minus that we have social media now to sort of highlight these situations?
So for this particular issue, it's definitely a plus, because it's just getting so much more visibility, right?
Yeah.
Without it being filmed and without it being shared. No one would know about it, and it's unfortunate that it happened, but it's really helping to bring these issues to the forefront, especially when you have various politicians talking about it and sending out things on Twitter. That's really powerful. But what we're really hoping for is that action follows. It's one thing to retweet something; it's another thing to actually sign a bill or put your name on a bill and pass it into law. So we're hoping that's going to follow.
Wonderful. So before we wrap up, just wanted to go over some of the rights of street vendors. If you could list the ones that they have.
Right. So it really depends on your standing sort of when it comes to licensing and permitting. So unfortunately, if you're a licensed vendor and you have a permit and you're selling from a permitted cart or truck, you have the right to work in public space. That's the number one thing, right? The city has created some permits for vendors to work on our streets and sidewalk, and sometimes vendors will get chased away by owners of a building or other property managers who don't want them there, even though they have the right to be there. So that's number one. If you're a licensed and permitted vendor and you're in a legal spot, you have the right to be there, and no one can tell you to move unless there's sort of an emergency situation that requires you to temporarily move. If you're an unlicensed and unpermitted vendor, that's a bigger risk, right? So unfortunately, legally, the city doesn't give you the right to sell in public space if you don't have a license or permit. So it's very, very risky. But you would have the same rights as anyone else, that if you get arrested or have your property taken, right, you have the right to due process, you have the right to an attorney, you have the right to challenge your property confiscation if they do take your cart. So that's something that we assist vendors with at the Street Vendor Project. But I think that vendors, inherently and should have the rights of any small business.
Right.
That's because that's what they are. They're
Right.
working in the streets. The police shouldn't be involved, and they should be respected and seen as small businesses and not as a problem to deal with.
Agreed. Thank you, Matthew. All right, guys, thanks for joining us. Maggie, thank you. For more information on the Street Vendor Project, visit streetvendor.org. Follow them on Instagram at Street Vendor Project, and send any inquiries you have to svpd@urbanjustice.org. Well, that's all for the show, guys. Thank you again for tuning in, and thank you to our guests today for joining us. Tune in every Thursday at 6:30 p.m. here on BronxNet, Optimum 67 and FiOS 33. Also tune in on the go at bronxnet.org and find us on YouTube. From BronxNet to the world, this is Foodie Down Bronx.